Annie Derrick was very pretty that evening. She was dressed in a gray silk gown with a collar of pink velvet. Her light brown hair, that yet retained so much of its brightness, was transfixed by a high shell comb, very Spanish. But the look of uneasiness in her large eyes, the eyes of a young girl, was deepening every day. The expression of innocence and inquiry which they so easily assumed was disturbed by a faint suggestion of aversion, almost of terror. She settled herself in her place, in the corner of the hall, in the rear rank of chairs, a little frightened by the glare of lights, the hum of talk, and the shifting crowd, glad to be out of the way, to attract no attention, willing to obliterate herself. All at once Annixter, who had just shaken hands with Dyke, his mother, and the little Tad, moved abruptly in his place, drawing in his breath sharply. The crowd around the great, wide-open main door of the barn had somewhat thinned out, and in the few groups that still remained there he had suddenly recognized Mr. and Mrs. Tree and Hilma, making their way toward some empty seats near the entrance of the feed-room. In the dusky light of the barn earlier in the evening, Annixter had not been able to see Hilma plainly. Now, however, as she passed before his eyes in the glittering radiance of the lamps and lanterns, he caught his breath in astonishment. Never had she appeared more beautiful in his eyes. It did not seem possible that this was the same girl whom he saw every day in and around the ranch house and dairy, the girl of simple calico frocks and plain shirt-waists, who brought him his dinner, who made up his bed. Now he could not take his eyes from her. Hilma, for the first time, was wearing her hair done high upon her head. The thick, sweet-smelling masses, bitumen brown in the shadows, coruscated like golden filaments in the light. Her organdy frock was long, longer than any she had yet worn. It left a little of her neck and breast bare, and all of her arm. Annixter muttered an exclamation. Such arms! How did she manage to keep them hid on ordinary occasions? Big at the shoulder, tapering with delicious modulations to the elbow and wrist, overlaid with a delicate, gleaming luster. As often as she turned her head, the movement sent a slow undulation over her neck and shoulders, the pale, amber-tinted shadows under her chin coming and going over the creamy whiteness of the skin like the changing moire of silk. The pretty rose color of her cheek had deepened to a pale carnation. Annixter, his hands clasped behind him, stood watching. In a few moments Hilma was surrounded by a group of young men clamoring for dances. They came from all corners of the barn, leaving the other girls precipitately, almost rudely. There could be little doubt as to who was to be the belle of the occasion. Hilma's little triumph was immediate, complete. Annixter could hear her voice from time to time, its usual velvety huskiness vibrating to a note of exuberant gaiety. All at once the orchestra swung off into a march, the grand march. There was a great rush to secure partners. Young Vaca, still going the rounds, was pushed to one side. The gaily apparelled clerk from the Bonneville store lost his head in the confusion. He could not find his partner. He roamed wildly about the barn, bewildered, his eyes rolling. He resolved to prepare an elaborate program card on the back of an old envelope. Rapidly the line was formed, Hilma and Haran Derrick in the lead, Annixter having obstinately refused to engage in either march, set, or dance the whole evening. Soon the confused shuffling of feet settled to a measured cadence. The orchestra blared and wailed, the snare drum rolling at exact intervals, the cornet marking the time. It was 8:30 o'clock. Annixter drew a long breath. "Good," he muttered. "The thing is under way at last." Singularly enough, Osterman also refused to dance. The week before he had returned from Los Angeles, bursting with the importance of his mission. He had been successful. He had Disbrow in his pocket. He was impatient to pose before the others of the committee as a skillful political agent, a manipulator. He forgot his attitude of the early part of the evening when he had drawn attention to himself with his wonderful clothes. Now his comic actor's face, with its brownish-red cheeks, protuberant ears, and horizontal slit of a mouth, was overcast with gravity. His bald forehead was seamed with the wrinkles of responsibility. He drew Annixter into one of the empty stalls and began an elaborate explanation, glib, voluble, interminable, going over again in detail what he had reported to the committee in outline. "I managed, I schemed, I kept dark. I lay low. But Annixter refused to listen. Oh, rot your schemes. There's a punch in the harness room that will make the hair grow on the top of your head in the place where the hair ought to grow. Come on, we'll round up some of the boys and walk into it. They edged their way around the hall outside the Grand March toward the harness room, picking up on their way Caraher, Dyke, Hooven, and old Broderson. Once in the harness room, Annixter shot the bolt. That affair outside, he observed, will take care of itself, but here's a little orphan child that gets lonesome without company. Annixter began ladling the punch, filling the glasses. Osterman proposed a toast to Kiansabi and the biggest barn. Their elbows crooked in silence. Old Broderson set down his glass, wiping his long beard and remarking, That certainly is very, very agreeable. I remember a punch I drank on Christmas Day in '83, or no, it was '84. Anyhow, that punch. It was in Ukiah. 'Twas '83. He wandered on aimlessly, unable to stop his flow of speech, losing himself in details, involving his talk in a hopeless maze of trivialities to which nobody paid any attention. "I don't drink myself," observed Dyke, "but just a taste of that with a lot of water wouldn't be bad for the little tad. She'd think it was lemonade." He was about to mix a glass for Sidney, but thought better of it at the last moment. "It's the chartreuse that's lacking," commented Caraher, lowering at Annixter. The other flared up on the instant. "Rot! Rot! I know better. In some punches it goes, and then, again in others, it don't." But it was left to Hooven to launch the successful phrase. "Gesundheit," he exclaimed, holding out his second glass. After drinking, he replaced it on the table with a long breath. "Ach, Gott!" he cried. "Dot punch! Say, I think dot punch makes some damn good fertilizer, eh?" Fertilizer. The others roared with laughter. "Good eye, Bismarck," commented Annixter. The name had a great success. Thereafter, throughout the evening, the punch was invariably spoken of as the fertilizer. Osterman, having spilt the bottom of a glassful on the floor, pretended that he saw shoots of grain coming up on the spot. Suddenly he turned upon old Broderson. "I'm bald, ain't I? Want to know how I lost my hair? Promise you won't ask a single other question, and I'll tell you. Promise your word of honor." "Eh, what? I don't understand. Your hair? Yes, I'll promise. How did you lose it?" "It was bit off." The other gazed at him, stupefied. His jaw dropped. The company shouted, and old Broderson, believing he had somehow accomplished a witticism, chuckled in his beard, wagging his head. But suddenly he fell grave, struck with an idea. He demanded, "Yes, I know, but what bit it off?" "Ah," vociferated Osterman, "that's just what you promised not to ask." The company doubled up with hilarity. Caraher leaned against the door, holding his sides. But Hooven, all abroad, unable to follow, gazed from face to face with a vacant grin, thinking it was still a question of his famous phrase. "Fertilizer, hey? Dot's some joke, hey? You bet." What with the noise of their talk and laughter, it was some time before Dyke, first of all, heard a persistent knocking on the bolted door. He called Annixter's attention to the sound. Cursing the intruder, Annixter unbolted and opened the door. But at once his manner changed. "Hello, it's Presley. Come in, Press." There was a shout of welcome from the others. A spirit of effusive cordiality had begun to dominate the gathering. Annixter caught sight of Vanamee back of Presley, and, waiving for the moment the distinction of employer and employee, insisted that both the friends should come in. "Any friend of Press is my friend," he declared. But when the two had entered and had exchanged greetings, Presley drew Annixter aside. "Vanamee and I have just come from Bonneville," he explained. "We saw Delaney there. He's got the buckskin, and he's full of bad whiskey and Dago red. You should see him. He's wearing all his cow-punching outfit, hair trousers, sombrero, spurs, and all the rest of it, and he has strapped himself to a big revolver. He says he wasn't invited to your barn dance, but that he's coming over to shoot up the place. He says you promised to show him off Kiansabi at the toe of your boot, and that he's going to give you the chance tonight." "Ah," commented Annixter, nodding his head. "He is he?" Presley was disappointed. Knowing Annixter's irascibility, he had expected to produce a more dramatic effect. He began to explain the danger of the business. Delaney had once knifed a greaser in the Panamint country. He was known as a bad man, but Annixter refused to be drawn. "All right," he said, "that's all right. Don't tell anybody else. You might scare the girls off. Get in and drink." Outside, the dancing was by this time in full swing. The orchestra was playing a polka. Young Vaca, now at his 50th wax candle, had brought the floor to the slippery surface of glass. The druggist was dancing with one of the Spanish-Mexican girls with the solemnity of an automaton, turning about and about, always in the same direction, his eyes glassy, his teeth set. Hilma Tree was dancing for the second time with Haran Derrick. She danced with infinite grace. Her cheeks were bright red, her eyes half closed, and through her parted lips she drew from time to time a long tremulous breath of pure delight. The music, the weaving colors, the heat of the air, by now a little oppressive, the monotony of repeated sensation, even the pain of physical fatigue had exalted all her senses. She was in a dreamy lethargy of happiness. It was her first ball. She could have danced without stopping until morning. Minna Hooven and Cutter were promenading. Mrs. Hooven, with little Hilda already asleep on her knees, never took her eyes from her daughter's gown. As often as Minna passed near her, she vented an energetic psst, psst. The metal tip of a white drawstring was showing from underneath the waist of Minna's dress. Mrs. Hooven was on the point of tears. The solitary, gaily apparelled clerk from Bonneville was in a fever of agitation. He had lost his elaborate program card. Bewildered, beside himself with trepidation, he hurried about the room, jostled by the dancing couples, tripping over the feet of those who were seated. He peered distressfully under the chairs and about the floor, asking anxious questions. Magnus Derrick, the center of a listening circle of ranchers, Garnett from the Ruby Rancho, Keast from the ranch of the same name, Gethings and Chattern of the San Pablo, and Bonanza, stood near the great open doorway of the barn, discussing the possibility of a shortage in the world's wheat crop for the next year. Abruptly the orchestra ceased playing with a roll of the snare drum, a flourish of the cornet, and a prolonged growl of the bass viol. The dance broke up, the couples hurrying to their seats, leaving the gaily apparelled clerk suddenly isolated in the middle of the floor, rolling his eyes. The druggist released the Spanish-Mexican girl with mechanical precision out amidst the crowd of dancers. He bowed, dropping his chin upon his cravat. Throughout the dance neither had hazarded a word. The girl found her way alone to a chair, but the druggist, sick from continually revolving in the same direction, walked unsteadily toward the wall. All at once the barn reeled around him. He fell down. There was a great laugh, but he scrambled to his feet and disappeared abruptly out into the night through the doorway of the barn, deathly pale, his hand upon his stomach. Dabney, the old man whom nobody knew, approached the group of ranchers around Magnus Derrick and stood, a little removed, listening gravely to what the governor was saying, his chin sunk in his collar, silent, offering no opinions. But the leader of the orchestra, with a great gesture of his violin bow, cried out, "All take partners for the Lancers and promenade around the hall." However, there was a delay. A little crowd formed around the musicians' platform. Voices were raised. There was a commotion. Skeezicks, who played the big horn, accused the cornet and the snare drum of stealing his cold lunch. At intervals he could be heard expostulating, "Ah, no, at the end of the end. Render me the sausages, you, or less I break your throat. Aha, I know you. You are going to play me there a bad farce. My sausages and the pork sandwich, else I go away from this place." He made an exaggerated show of replacing his big horn in its case, but the bystanders raised a great protest. The sandwiches and one sausage were produced. The other had disappeared. In the end, Skeezicks allowed himself to be appeased. The dance was resumed. Half an hour later, the gathering in the harness room was considerably reinforced. It was the corner of the barn toward which the male guests naturally gravitated. Haran Derrick, who only cared to dance with Hilma Tree, was admitted. Garnett from the Ruby Rancho and Gethings from the San Pablo came in a little afterwards. A fourth bowl of punch was mixed, Annixter and Caraher clamoring into each other's face as to its ingredients. Cigars were lighted. Soon the air of the room became blue with an acrid haze of smoke. It was very warm. Ranged in their chairs around the side of the room, the guests emptied glass after glass. Vanamee alone refused to drink. He sat a little to one side, disassociating himself from what was going forward, watching the others calmly, a little contemptuously, a cigarette in his fingers. Hooven, after drinking his third glass, however, was afflicted with a great sadness. His breast heaved with immense sighs. He asserted that he was oppressed. Cutter had taken his steer. He retired to a corner and seated himself in a heap on his chair, his heels on the rungs, wiping the tears from his eyes, refusing to be comforted. Old Broderson startled Annixter, who sat next to him, out of all measure by suddenly winking at him with infinite craftiness. "When I was a lad in Ukiah," he whispered hoarsely, "I was a devil of a fellow with the girls. But, Lordy," he nudged him slyly, "I wouldn't have it known." Of those who were drinking, Annixter alone retained all his wits. Though keeping pace with the others, glass for glass, the punch left him solid upon his feet, clear-headed. The tough, cross-grained fibre of him seemed proof against alcohol. Never in his life had he been drunk. He prided himself upon his power of resistance. It was his nature. "Say," exclaimed old Broderson, gravely addressing the company, pulling at his beard uneasily, "say, listen, I'm a devil of a fellow with the girls." He wagged his head doggedly, shutting his eyes in a knowing fashion. "Yes, sir, I am. There was a young lady in Ukiah. That was when I was a lad of 17. We used to meet in the cemetery in the afternoons. I was to go away to school at Sacramento, and the afternoon I left we met in the cemetery, and we stayed so long I almost missed the train. Her name was Celestine." There was a pause. The others waited for the rest of the story. "And afterwards?" prompted Annixter. "Afterwards? Nothing afterwards. I never saw her again. Her name was Celestine." The company raised a chorus of derision, and Osterman cried ironically, "Say, that's a pretty good one. Tell us another." The old man laughed with the rest, believing he had made another hit. He called Osterman to him, whispering in his ear, "Shh, look here. Some night you and I will go up to San Francisco, eh? We'll go skylarking. We'll be gay. Oh, I'm a rare old buck, I am. I ain't too old. You'll see." Annixter gave over the making of the fifth bowl of punch to Osterman, who affirmed that he had a recipe for a fertilizer from Solotari that would take the plating off the ladle. He left him wrangling with Caraher, who still persisted in adding chartreuse, and stepped out into the dance to see how things were getting on. It was the interval between two dances. In and around a stall at the farther end of the floor, where lemonade was being served, was a great throng of young men. Others hurried across the floor, singly or by twos and threes, gingerly carrying overflowing glasses to their partners, sitting in long rows of white and blue and pink against the opposite wall, their mothers and older sisters in a second dark-clothed rank behind them. A babble of talk was in the air, mingled with gusts of laughter. Everybody seemed having a good time. In the increasing heat, the decorations of evergreen trees and festoons threw off a pungent aroma that suggested a Sunday school Christmas festival. In the other stalls, lower down the barn, the young men had brought chairs, and in these deep recesses the most desperate love-making was in progress. The young man, his hair neatly parted, leaning with great solicitation over the girl, his partner for the moment, fanning her conscientiously, his arm carefully laid along the back of her chair. By the doorway, Annixter met Sarria, who had stepped out to smoke a fat black cigar. The set smile of amiability was still fixed on the priest's smooth, shiny face. The cigar ashes had left gray streaks on the front of his cassock. He avoided Annixter, fearing, no doubt, an allusion to his gamecocks, and took up his position back of the second rank of chairs by the musician's stand, beaming encouragingly upon every one who caught his eye. Annixter was saluted right and left as he slowly went the round of the floor. At every moment he had to pause to shake hands and to listen to congratulations upon the size of his barn and the success of his dance. But he was distrait, his thoughts elsewhere. He did not attempt to hide his impatience when some of the young men tried to engage him in conversation, asking him to be introduced to their sisters or their friends' sisters. He sent them about their business harshly, abominably rude, leaving a wake of angry disturbance behind him, sowing the seeds of future quarrels and renewed unpopularity. He was looking for Hilma Tree. When at last he came unexpectedly upon her, standing near where Mrs. Tree was seated, some half-dozen young men hovering uneasily in her neighborhood, all his audacity was suddenly stricken from him. His gruffness, his overbearing insolence vanished with an abruptness that left him cold. His old-time confusion and embarrassment returned to him. Instead of speaking to her, as he intended, he affected not to see her, but passed by, his head in the air, pretending a sudden interest in a Japanese lantern that was about to catch fire. But he had had a single distinct glimpse of her, definite, precise, and this glimpse was enough. Hilma had changed. The change was subtle, evanescent, hard to define, but not the less unmistakable. The excitement, the enchanting delight, the delicious disturbance of the first ball had produced its result. Perhaps there had only been this lacking. It was hard to say, but for that brief instant of time Annixter was looking at Hilma, the woman. She was no longer the young girl upon whom he might look down, to whom he might condescend, whose little infantile graces were to be considered with amused toleration. When Annixter returned to the harness-room, he let himself into a clamor of masculine hilarity. Osterman had, indeed, made a marvelous fertilizer, whiskey for the most part, diluted with champagne and lemon juice. The first round of this drink had been welcomed with a salvo of cheers. Hooven, recovering his spirits under its violent stimulation, spoke of having it out mit Cutter, by Gott, while Osterman, standing on a chair at the end of the room, shouted for a few moments' quiet, gentlemen, so that he might tell a certain story he knew. But abruptly Annixter discovered that the liquors, the champagne, whiskey, brandy, and the like, were running low. This would never do. He felt that he would stand disgraced if it could be said afterward that he had not provided sufficient drink at his entertainment. He slipped out unobserved, and finding two of his ranch hands near the doorway, sent them down to the ranch house to bring up all the cases of stuff they found there. However, when this matter had been attended to, Annixter did not immediately return to the harness-room. On the floor of the barn a square dance was under way, the leader of the city band calling the figures. Young Vaca indefatigably continued the rounds of the barn, pairing candle after candle, possessed with this single idea of duty, pushing the dancers out of his way, refusing to admit that the floor was yet sufficiently slippery. The druggist had returned indoors, and leaned dejected and melancholy against the wall near the doorway, unable to dance, his evening's enjoyment spoiled. The gaily apparelled clerk from Bonneville had just involved himself in a deplorable incident. In a search for his handkerchief, which he had lost while trying to find his program card, he had inadvertently wandered into the feed-room, set apart as the ladies' dressing-room, at the moment when Mrs. Hooven, having removed the waist of Minna's dress, was relacing her corsets. There was a tremendous scene. The clerk was ejected forcibly, Mrs. Hooven filling all the neighborhood with shrill expostulation. A young man, Minna's partner, who stood near the feed-room door, waiting for her to come out, had invited the clerk, with elaborate sarcasm, to step outside for a moment. And the clerk, breathless, stupefied, hustled from hand to hand, remained petrified, with staring eyes, turning about and about, looking wildly from face to face, speechless, witless, wondering what had happened. But the square dance was over. The city band was just beginning to play a waltz. Annixter, assuring himself that everything was going all right, was picking his way across the floor when he came upon Hilma Tree quite alone and looking anxiously among the crowd of dancers. "Having a good time, Miss Hilma?" he demanded, pausing for a moment. "Oh, am I, just!" she exclaimed. "The best time, but I don't know what has become of my partner. See, I'm left all alone, the only time this whole evening," she added proudly. "Have you seen him, my partner, sir? I forget his name. I only met him this evening, and I've met so many I can't begin to remember half of them. He was a young man from Bonneville, A clerk, I think, because I remember seeing him in a store there, and he wore the prettiest clothes." "I guess he got lost in the shuffle," observed Annixter. Suddenly an idea occurred to him. He took his resolution in both hands. He clenched his teeth. "Say, look here, Miss Hilma, what's the matter with you and I stealing this one for ourselves? I don't mean to dance. I don't propose to make a jumping jack of myself for some galoot to give me the laugh, but we'll walk around. Will you? What do you say?" Hilma consented. "I'm not so very sorry I missed my dance with that little clerk," she said guiltily. "I suppose that's very bad of me, isn't it?" Annixter fulminated a vigorous protest. "I am so warm," murmured Hilma, fanning herself with her handkerchief. "And oh, such a good time as I have had! I was so afraid that I would be a wallflower and sit up by Mamma and Papa the whole evening. And as it is, I have had every single dance, and even some dances I had to split." "Oh," she breathed, glancing lovingly around the barn, noting again the festoons of tricolored cambric, the Japanese lanterns, flaring lamps, and decorations of evergreen. "Oh, it's all so lovely, just like a fairy story. And to think that it can't last but for one little evening, and that tomorrow morning one must wake up to the everyday things again." "Well," observed Annixter doggedly, unwilling that she should forget whom she ought to thank, "I did my best, and my best is as good as another man's, I guess." Hilma overwhelmed him with a burst of gratitude which he gruffly pretended to deprecate. Oh, that was all right. It hadn't cost him much. He liked to see people having a good time himself, and the crowd did seem to be enjoying themselves. What did she think? Did things look lively enough? And how about herself? Was she enjoying it? Stupidly, Annixter drove the question home again, at his wit's end as to how to make conversation. Hilma protested volubly she would never forget this night, adding, "Dance! Oh, you don't know how I love it. I didn't know myself. I could dance all night and never stop once." Annixter was smitten with uneasiness. No doubt this promenading was not at all to her taste. Wondering what kind of a spectacle he was about to make of himself, he exclaimed, "Want to dance now?" "Oh, yes," she returned. They paused in their walk, and Hilma, facing him, gave herself into his arms. Annixter shut his teeth, the perspiration starting from his forehead. For 5 years he had abandoned dancing. Never in his best days had it been one of his accomplishments. They hesitated a moment, waiting to catch the time from the musicians. Another couple bore down upon them at precisely the wrong moment, jostling them out of step. Annixter swore under his breath. His arm still about the young woman, he pulled her over to one corner. "Now," he muttered, "we'll try again." A second time, listening to the 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 cadence of the musicians, they endeavored to get under way. Annixter waited the fraction of a second too long, and stepped on Hilma's foot. On the third attempt, having worked out of the corner, a pair of dancers bumped into them once more, and as they were recovering themselves, another couple caromed violently against Annixter, so that he all but lost his footing. He was in a rage. Hilma, very embarrassed, was trying not to laugh, and thus they found themselves, out in the middle of the floor, continually jostled from their position, holding clumsily to each other, stammering excuses into one another's faces, when Delaney arrived. He came with the suddenness of an explosion. There was a commotion by the doorway, a rolling burst of oaths, a furious stamping of hoofs, a wild scramble of the dancers to either side of the room, and there he was. He had ridden the buckskin at a gallop straight through the doorway and out into the middle of the floor of the barn. Once well inside, Delaney hauled up on the cruel spade bit, at the same time driving home the spurs, and the buckskin, without halting in her gait, rose into the air upon her hind feet, and coming down again with the thunder of iron hoofs upon the hollow floor, lashed out with both heels simultaneously, her back arched, her head between her knees. It was the running buck, and had not Delaney been the hardest buster in the county, would have flung him headlong like a sack of sand. But he eased off the bit, gripping the mare's flanks with his knees, and the buckskin, having long since known her master, came to hand quivering, the bloody spume dripping from the bit upon the slippery floor. Delaney had arrayed himself with painful elaboration, determined to look the part, bent upon creating the impression, resolved that his appearance at least should justify his reputation of being bad. Nothing was lacking, neither the campaign hat with upturned brim, nor the dotted blue handkerchief knotted behind the neck, nor the heavy gauntlets stitched with red, nor, this above all, the bearskin chaparejos, the hair trousers of the mountain cowboy, the pistol holster low on the thigh. But for the moment this holster was empty, and in his right hand, the hammer at full cock, the chamber loaded, the puncher flourished his teaser, an army Colt's, the lamplight dully reflected in the dark blue steel. In a second of time the dance was a bedlam. The musicians stopped with a discord, and the middle of the crowded floor bared itself instantly. It was like sand blown from off a rock. The throng of guests, carried by an impulse that was not to be resisted, bore back against the sides of the barn, overturning chairs, tripping upon each other, falling down, scrambling to their feet again, stepping over one another, getting behind each other, diving under chairs, flattening themselves against the wall, a wild, clamoring pell-mell, blind, deaf, panic-stricken. A confused tangle of waving arms, torn muslin, crushed flowers, pale faces, tangled legs that swept in all directions back from the center of the floor, leaving Annixter and Hilma alone, deserted, their arms about each other, face to face with Delaney, mad with alcohol, bursting with remembered insult, bent on evil, reckless of results. After the first scramble for safety, the crowd fell quiet for the fraction of an instant, glued to the walls, afraid to stir, struck dumb and motionless with surprise and terror, and in the instant silence that followed, Annixter, his eyes on Delaney, muttered rapidly to Hilma, "Get back. Get away to one side. The fool might shoot." There was a second's respite afforded while Delaney occupied himself in quieting the buckskin. And in that second of time, at this moment of crisis, the wonderful thing occurred. Hilma, turning from Delaney, her hands clasped on Annixter's arm, her eyes meeting his, exclaimed, "You too." And that was all, but to Annixter it was a revelation. Never more alive to his surroundings, never more observant, he suddenly understood. For the briefest lapse of time, he and Hilma looked deep into each other's eyes, and from that moment on, Annixter knew that Hilma cared. The whole matter was brief as the snapping of a finger. 2 words and a glance, and all was done. But, as though nothing had occurred, Annixter pushed Hilma from him, repeating harshly, "Get back, I tell you. Don't you see he's got a gun? Haven't I enough on my hands without you?" He loosed her clasp, and his eyes, once more on Delaney, moved diagonally backwards toward the side of the barn, pushing Hilma from him. In the end, he thrust her away so sharply that she gave back with a long stagger. Somebody caught her arm and drew her in, leaving Annixter alone once more in the middle of the floor, his hands in his coat pockets, watchful, alert, facing his enemy. But the cowpuncher was not ready to come to grapples yet. Fearless, his wits gambling under the lash of the alcohol, he wished to make the most of the occasion, maintaining the suspense, playing for the gallery. By touches of the hand and knee, he kept the buckskin in continual nervous movement, her hoofs clattering, snorting, tossing her head, while he himself, addressing himself to Annixter, poured out a torrent of invective. "Well, strike me blind if it ain't old Buck Annixter. He was going to show me off the Quien-Sabe at the toe of his boot, was he? Well, here's your chance, with the ladies to see you do it. Gives a dance, does he, highfalutin' hoedown in his barn, and forgets to invite his old bronco-bustin' friend. But his friend don't forget him. No, he don't. He remembers little things, does his bronco-bustin' friend. Likes to see a dance hisself on occasion, his friend does. Comes anyhow, trustin' his welcome will be hearty, just to see old Buck Annixter dance, just to show Buck Annixter's friends how Buck can dance. Dance all by hisself, a little hen on a hot plate dance when his bronco-bustin' friend asks him so polite. A little dance for the ladies, Buck. This feature of the entertainment is alone worth the price of admission. Tune up, Buck. Attention now, I'll give you the key." He fanned his revolver, spinning it about his index finger by the trigger guard with incredible swiftness, the twirling weapon a mere blur of blue steel in his hand. Suddenly, and without any apparent cessation of the movement, he fired, and a little splinter of wood flipped into the air at Annixter's feet. "Time," he shouted, while the buckskin reared to the report. "Hold on, wait a minute. This place is too light to suit. That big light yonder is in my eyes. Look out, I'm going to throw lead." A second shot put out the lamp over the musician's stand. The assembled guests shrieked. A frantic, shrinking quiver ran through the crowd like the huddling of frightened rabbits in their pen. Annixter hardly moved. He stood some 30 paces from the buster, his hands still in his coat pockets, his eyes glistening, watchful. Excitable and turbulent in trifling matters, when actual bodily danger threatened, he was of an abnormal quiet. "I'm watching you," cried the other. "Don't make any mistake about that. Keep your hands in your coat pockets if you'd like to live a little longer, understand? And don't let me see you make a move toward your hip, or your friends will be asked to identify you at the morgue tomorrow morning. When I'm bad, I'm called the undertaker's friend. So I am, and I'm that bad tonight that I'm scared of myself. They'll have to revise the census returns before I'm done with this place. Come on now, I'm getting tired waiting. I come to see a dance." "Hand over that horse, Delaney," said Annixter, without raising his voice, "and clear out." The other affected to be overwhelmed with infinite astonishment, his eyes staring. He peered down from the saddle. "What?" he exclaimed. "What did you say? Why, I guess you must be looking for trouble. That's what I guess." "There's where you're wrong, my son," muttered Annixter, partly to Delaney, partly to himself. "If I was looking for trouble, there wouldn't be any guesswork about it." With the words he began firing. Delaney had hardly entered the barn before Annixter's plan had been formed. Long since his revolver was in the pocket of his coat, and he fired now through the coat itself without withdrawing his hands. Until that moment Annixter had not been sure of himself. There was no doubt that for the first few moments of the affair he would have welcomed with joy any reasonable excuse for getting out of the situation. But the sound of his own revolver gave him confidence. He whipped it from his pocket and fired again. Abruptly the duel began, report following report, spurts of pale blue smoke jetting like the darts of short spears between the two men, expanding to a haze and drifting overhead in wavering strata. It was quite probable that no thought of killing each other suggested itself to either Annixter or Delaney. Both fired without aiming very deliberately. To empty their revolvers and avoid being hit was the desire common to both. They no longer vituperated each other. The revolvers spoke for them. Long after, Annixter could recall this moment. For years he could with but little effort reconstruct the scene. The densely packed crowd flattened against the sides of the barn, the festoons of lanterns, the mingled smell of evergreens, new wood, sachets, and powder smoke. The vague clamor of distress and terror that rose from the throng of guests, the squealing of the buckskin, the uneven explosions of the revolvers, the reverberation of trampling hoofs, a brief glimpse of Haran Derrick's excited face at the door of the harness room, and in the open space in the center of the floor, himself and Delaney maneuvering swiftly in a cloud of smoke. Annixter's revolver contained but 6 cartridges. Already it seemed to him as if he had fired 20 times. Without doubt the next shot was his last. Then what? He peered through the blue haze that with every discharge thickened between him and the buster. For his own safety he must place at least one shot. Delaney's chest and shoulders rose suddenly above the smoke close upon him as the distraught buckskin reared again. Annixter, for the first time during the fight, took definite aim. But before he could draw the trigger, there was a great shout, and he was aware of the buckskin, the bridle trailing, the saddle empty, plunging headlong across the floor, crashing into the line of chairs. Delaney was scrambling off the floor. There was blood on the buster's wrist, and he no longer carried his revolver. Suddenly he turned and ran. The crowd parted right and left before him as he made toward the doorway. He disappeared. 20 men promptly sprang to the buckskin's head, but she broke away, and, wild with terror, bewildered, blind, insensate, charged into the corner of the barn by the musician's stand. She brought up against the wall with cruel force, and with impact of a sack of stones. Her head was cut. She turned and charged again, bull-like, the blood streaming from her forehead. The crowd, shrieking, melted before her rush. An old man was thrown down and trampled. The buckskin trod upon the dragging bridle, somersaulted into a confusion of chairs in one corner, and came down with a terrific clatter in a wild disorder of kicking hoofs and splintered wood. But a crowd of men fell upon her, tugging at the bit, sitting on her head, shouting, gesticulating. For 5 minutes she struggled and fought. Then, by degrees, she recovered herself, drawing great sobbing breaths at long intervals that all but burst the girths, rolling her eyes in bewildered, supplicating fashion, trembling in every muscle, and starting and shrinking now and then like a young girl in hysterics. At last she lay quiet. The men allowed her to struggle to her feet. The saddle was removed, and she was led to one of the empty stalls, where she remained the rest of the evening, her head low, her pasterns quivering, turning her head apprehensively from time to time, showing the white of one eye, and at long intervals heaving a single prolonged sigh. And an hour later the dance was progressing as evenly as though nothing in the least extraordinary had occurred. The incident was closed. That abrupt swoop of terror and impending death dropping down there from out of the darkness, cutting abruptly athwart the gaiety of the moment, come and gone with the swiftness of a thunderclap. Many of the women had gone home, taking their men with them. But the great bulk of the crowd still remained, seeing no reason why the episode should interfere with the evening's enjoyment, resolved to hold the ground for mere bravado, if for nothing else. Delaney would not come back. Of that everybody was persuaded, and in case he should, there were not found wanting fully 100 young men who would give him a dressing down, by jingo. They had been too surprised to act when Delaney had first appeared, and before they knew where they were at, the buster had cleared out. In another minute, just another second, they would have shown him, yes, sir, by jingo, ah, you bet. On all sides the reminiscences began to circulate. At least one man in every 3 had been involved in a gunfight at some time of his life. Ah, you ought to have seen in Yuba County one time. Why, in Butte County in the early days? Sure, this tonight wasn't anything. Why, once in a saloon in Arizona when I was there, and so on over and over again. Osterman solemnly asserted that he had seen a greaser sawn in 2 in a Nevada sawmill. Old Broderson had witnessed a vigilante lynching in '55 on California Street in San Francisco. Dyke recalled how once in his engineering days he had run over a drunk at a street crossing. Gethings of the San Pablo had taken a shot at a highwayman. Hooven had bayoneted a French chasseur at Sedan. An old Spanish Mexican, a centenarian from Guadalajara, remembered Fremont's stand on a mountaintop in San Benito County. The druggist had fired at a burglar trying to break into his store one New Year's Eve. Young Vaca had seen a dog shot in Guadalajara. Father Soria had more than once administered the sacraments to Portuguese desperadoes dying of gunshot wounds. Even the women recalled terrible scenes. Mrs. Cutter recounted to an interested group how she had seen a claim jumped in Placer County in 1851, where 3 men were shot, falling in a fusillade of rifle shots, and expiring later upon the floor of her kitchen while she looked on. Mrs. Dyke had been in a stage hold-up when the shotgun messenger was murdered. Stories by the hundreds went the round of the company. The air was surcharged with blood, dying groans, the reek of powder smoke, the crack of rifles. All the legends of '49, the violent, wild life of the early days, were recalled to view, defiling them there in an endless procession under the glare of paper lanterns and kerosene lamps. But the affair had aroused a combative spirit amongst the men of the assembly. Instantly a spirit of aggression, of truculence, swelled up underneath waistcoats and starched shirt bosoms. More than one offender was promptly asked to step outside. But the affair had aroused a combative spirit amongst the men of the assembly. Instantly a spirit of aggression, of truculence, swelled up underneath waistcoats and starched shirt bosoms. More than one offender was promptly asked to step outside. It was like young bucks excited by an encounter of stags, lowering their horns upon the slightest provocation, showing off before the does and fawns. Old quarrels were remembered. One sought laboriously for slights and insults, veiled in ordinary conversation. The sense of personal honor became refined to a delicate, fine point. Upon the slightest pretext there was a haughty drawing up of the figure, a twisting of the lips into a smile of scorn. Caraher spoke of shooting S. Behrman on sight before the end of the week. Twice it became necessary to separate Hooven and Cutter, renewing their quarrel as to the ownership of the steer. All at once Minna Hooven's partner fell upon the gaily apparelled clerk from Bonneville, pummeling him with his fists, hustling him out of the hall, vociferating that Miss Hooven had been grossly insulted. It took 3 men to extricate the clerk from his clutches, dazed, gasping, his collar unfastened and sticking up into his face, his eyes staring wildly into the faces of the crowd. But Annixter, bursting with pride, his chest thrown out, his chin in the air, reigned enthroned in a circle of adulation. He was the hero. To shake him by the hand was an honor to be struggled for. One clapped him on the back with solemn nods of approval. "There's the boy for you. There was nerve for you. What's the matter with Annixter? How about that for sand? And how was that for a shot? Why, Apache Kid couldn't have bettered that. Cool enough. Took a steady eye and a sure hand to make a shot like that. There was a shot that would be told about in Tulare County 50 years to come." Annixter had refrained from replying, all ears to this conversation, wondering just what had happened. He knew only that Delaney had run, leaving his revolver and a spatter of blood behind him. By degrees, however, he ascertained that his last shot but one had struck Delaney's pistol hand, shattering it and knocking the revolver from his grip. He was overwhelmed with astonishment. Why, after the shooting began, he had not so much as seen Delaney with any degree of plainness. The whole affair was a whirl. "Well, where did you learn to shoot that way?" someone in the crowd demanded. Annixter moved his shoulders with a gesture of vast unconcern. "Oh," he observed carelessly, "it's not my shooting that ever worried me, my son." The crowd gaped with delight. There was a great wagging of heads. "Well, I guess not." "No, sir, not much." "Ah, no, you bet not." When the women pressed around him, shaking his hands, declaring that he had saved their daughters' lives, Annixter assumed a pose of superb deprecation, the modest self-obliteration of the chevalier. He delivered himself of a remembered phrase, very elegant, refined. It was Lancelot, after the tournament, Bayard receiving felicitations after the battle. "Oh, don't say anything about it," he murmured. "I only did what any man would have done in my place." To restore completely the equanimity of the company, he announced supper. This he had calculated as a tremendous surprise. It was to have been served at midnight, but the interruption of Delaney had dislocated the order of events, and the tables were brought in an hour ahead of time. They were arranged around 3 sides of the barn, and were loaded down with cold roasts of beef, cold chickens and cold ducks, mountains of sandwiches, pitchers of milk and lemonade, entire cheeses, bowls of olives, plates of oranges and nuts. The advent of this supper was received with a volley of applause. The musicians played a quick step. The company threw themselves upon the food with a great scraping of chairs and a vast rustle of muslins, tarletans, and organdies. Soon the clatter of dishes was a veritable uproar. The tables were taken by assault. One ate whatever was nearest at hand, some even beginning with oranges and nuts and ending with beef and chicken. At the end, the paper caps were brought on, together with the ice cream. All up and down the tables the pulled crackers snapped continually, like the discharge of innumerable tiny rifles. The caps of tissue paper were put on, Phrygian bonnets, magician's caps, liberty caps. The young girls looked across the table at their vis-a-vis with bursts of laughter and vigorous clapping of the hands. The harness-room crowd had a table to themselves, at the head of which sat Annixter, and at the foot Harron. The gunfight had sobered Presley thoroughly. He sat by the side of Vanamee, who ate but little, preferring rather to watch the scene with calm observation, a little contemptuous when the uproar around the table was too boisterous, savouring of intoxication. Osterman rolled bullets of bread and shot them with astonishing force up and down the table. But the others, Dyke, old Broderson, Caraher, Harron Derrick, Hooven, Cutter, Garnett of the Ruby Rancho, Keast from the ranch of the same name, Gethings of the San Pablo, and Chattern of the Bonanza, occupied themselves with eating as much as they could before the supper gave out. At a corner of the table, speechless, unobserved, ignored, sat Dabney, of whom nothing was known but his name, the silent old man who made no friends. He ate and drank quietly, dipping his sandwich in his lemonade. Osterman ate all the olives he could lay his hands on, 100 of them, 50 of them, 100 of them. He touched no crumb of anything else. Old Broderson stared at him, his jaw fallen. Osterman declared he had once eaten 1,000 on a bet. The men called each other's attention to him. Delighted to create a sensation, Osterman persevered. The contents of an entire bowl disappeared in his huge reptilian slit of a mouth. His cheeks of brownish red were extended, his bald forehead glistened. Colics seized upon him. His stomach revolted. It was all one with him. He was satisfied, contented. He was astonishing the people. "Once I swallowed a tree-toad," he told old Broderson, by mistake. "I was eating grapes, and the beggar lived in me 3 weeks. In rainy weather he would sing. You don't believe that," he vociferated. "Haven't I got the toad at home now in a bottle of alcohol?" And the old man, never doubting, his eyes starting, wagged his head in amazement. "Oh, yes," cried Caraher, the length of the table. "That's a pretty good one. Tell us another." "That reminds me of a story," hazarded old Broderson uncertainly. "Once when I was a lad in Ukiah, 50 years—" "Oh, yes," cried half a dozen voices. "That's a pretty good one. Tell us another." "Eh? What?" murmured Broderson, looking about him. "I don't know. It was Ukiah. You mix me all up." As soon as supper was over, the floor was cleared again. The guests clamored for a Virginia reel. The last quarter of the evening, the time of the most riotous fun, was beginning. The young men caught the girls who sat next to them. The orchestra dashed off into a rollicking movement. The 2 lines were formed. In a second of time the dance was under way again, guests still wearing the Phrygian bonnets and liberty caps of pink and blue tissue paper. But the group of men once more adjourned to the harness room. Fresh boxes of cigars were opened. The 7th bowl of fertilizer was mixed. Osterman poured the dregs of a glass of it upon his bald head, declaring that he could feel the hair beginning to grow. And suddenly old Broderson rose to his feet. "Aha!" he cackled. "I'm going to have a dance, I am. Think I'm too old? I'll show you young fellows. I'm a regular old rooster when I get started." He marched out into the barn, the others following, holding their sides. He found an aged Mexican woman by the door, and hustled her, all confused and giggling, into the Virginia reel, then at its height. Everyone crowded around to see. Old Broderson stepped off with the alacrity of a colt, snapping his fingers, slapping his thigh, his mouth widening in an excited grin. The entire company of the guests shouted. The city band redoubled their efforts, and the old man, losing his head, breathless, gasping, dislocated his stiff joints in his efforts. He became possessed, bowing, scraping, advancing, retreating, wagging his beard, cutting pigeons' wings, distraught with the music, the clamor, the applause, the effects of the fertilizer. Annixter shouted, "Nice eye, Santa Claus!" But Annixter's attention wandered. He searched for Hilma Tree, having still in mind the look in her eyes at that swift moment of danger. He had not seen her since then. At last he caught sight of her. She was not dancing, but instead was sitting with her partner at the end of the barn near her father and mother, her eyes wide, a serious expression on her face, her thoughts, no doubt, elsewhere. Annixter was about to go to her when he was interrupted by a cry. Old Broderson, in the midst of a double shuffle, had clapped his hand to his side with a gasp, which he followed by a whoop of anguish. He had got a stitch or had started to twinge somewhere. With a gesture of resignation, he drew himself laboriously out of the dance, limping abominably, one leg dragging. He was heard asking for his wife. Old Mrs. Broderson took him in charge. She jawed him for making an exhibition of himself, scolding as though he were a 10-year-old. "Well, I want to know," she exclaimed, as he hobbled off, dejected and melancholy, leaning upon her arm. "Thought he had to dance, indeed. What next? A gay old grandpa, this. He'd better be thinking of his coffin." It was almost midnight. The dance drew toward its close in a storm of jubilation. The perspiring musicians toiled like galley slaves, the guests singing as they danced. The group of men reassembled in the harness room. Even Magnus Derrick condescended to enter and drink a toast. Presley and Vanamy, still holding themselves aloof, looked on, Vanamy more and more disgusted. Dabney, standing to one side, overlooked and forgotten, continued to sip steadily at his glass, solemn, reserved. Garnett of the Ruby Rancho, Keast from the ranch of the same name, Gethings of the San Pablo, and Chattern of the Bonanza leaned back in their chairs, their waistcoats unbuttoned, their legs spread wide, laughing, they could not tell why. Other ranchers, men whom Annixter had never seen, appeared in the room, wheat growers from places as far distant as Goshen and Pixley. Young men and old, proprietors of veritable principalities, hundreds of thousands of acres of wheatlands, a dozen of them, a score of them. Men who were strangers to each other, but who made it a point to shake hands with Magnus Derrick, the prominent man of the valley. Old Broderson, whom everyone had believed had gone home, returned, though much sobered, and took his place, refusing, however, to drink another spoonful. Soon the entire number of Annixter's guests found themselves in two companies, the dancers on the floor of the barn, frolicking through the last figures of the Virginia reel, and the boisterous gathering of men in the harness room, downing the last quarts of fertilizer. Both assemblies had been increased. Even the older people had joined in the dance, while nearly every one of the men who did not dance had found their way into the harness room. The two groups rivaled each other in their noise. Out on the floor of the barn was a very whirlwind of gaiety, a tempest of laughter, hand-clapping and cries of amusement. In the harness room, the confused shouting and singing, the stamping of heavy feet, set a quivering reverberation in the oil of the kerosene lamps, the flame of the candles and the Japanese lanterns flaring and swaying in the gusts of hilarity. At intervals between the two, one heard the music, the wailing of the violins, the vigorous snarling of the cornet, and the harsh, incessant rasping of the snare drum. And at times all these various sounds mingled in a single vague note, huge, clamorous, that rose up into the night from the colossal, reverberating compass of the barn, and sent its echoes far off across the unbroken levels of the surrounding ranches, stretching out to infinity under the clouded sky, calm, mysterious, still. Annixter, the punch bowl clasped in his arms, was pouring out the last spoonful of liquor into Carraher's glass when he was aware that someone was pulling at the sleeve of his coat. He set down the punch bowl. "Well, where did you come from?" he demanded. It was a messenger from Bonneville, the uniformed boy that the telephone company employed to carry messages. He had just arrived from town on his bicycle, out of breath and panting. "Message for you, sir. Will you sign?" He held the book to Annixter, who signed the receipt, wondering. The boy departed, leaving a thick envelope of yellow paper in Annixter's hands, the address typewritten, the word urgent written in blue pencil in one corner. Annixter tore it open. The envelope contained other sealed envelopes, some 8 or 10 of them, addressed to Magnus Derrick, Osterman, Broderson, Garnett, Keast, Gethings, Chattern, Dabney, and to Annixter himself. Still puzzled, Annixter distributed the envelopes, muttering to himself, "What's up now?" The incident had attracted attention. A comparative quiet followed, the guests following the letters with their eyes as they were passed around the table. They fancied that Annixter had arranged a surprise. Magnus Derrick, who sat next to Annixter, was the first to receive his letter. With a word of excuse he opened it. Read it, Governor," shouted a half-dozen voices. "No secrets, you know. Everything above board here tonight." Magnus cast a glance at the contents of the letter, then rose to his feet and read, Magnus Derrick, Bonneville, Tulare County, California. Dear Sir, by regrade of October 1st, the value of the railroad land you occupy, included in your ranch of Los Muertos, has been fixed at $27 per acre. The land is now for sale at that price to anyone. Yours, etc., Cyrus Blakely Ruggles, Land Agent P and SWRR, S. Behrman, Local Agent P and SWRR. In the midst of the profound silence that followed, Osterman was heard to exclaim grimly, "That's a pretty good one. Tell us another." But for a long moment this was the only remark. The silence widened, broken only by the sound of torn paper, as Annixter, Osterman, Old Broderson, Garnett, Keast, Gethings, Chattern, and Dabney opened and read their letters. They were all to the same effect, almost word for word like the governor's. Only the figures and the proper names varied. In some cases the price per acre was $22. In Annixter's case it was $30. And the company promised to sell to me, to all of us, gasped Old Broderson, at $2.50 an acre. It was not alone the ranchers immediately around Bonneville who would be plundered by this move on the part of the railroad. The alternate section system applied throughout all the San Joaquin. By striking at the Bonneville ranchers, a terrible precedent was established. Of the crowd of guests in the harness room alone, nearly every man was affected, every man menaced with ruin. All of 1,000,000 acres was suddenly involved. Then, suddenly, the tempest burst. A dozen men were on their feet in an instant, their teeth set, their fists clenched, their faces purple with rage. Oaths, curses, maledictions exploded like the firing of successive mines. Voices quivered with wrath, hands flung upward, the fingers hooked, prehensile, trembled with anger. The sense of wrongs, the injustices, the oppression, extortion, and pillage of 20 years suddenly culminated and found voice in a raucous howl of execration. For a second there was nothing articulate in that cry of savage exasperation, nothing even intelligent. It was the human animal hounded to its corner, exploited, harried to its last stand, at bay, ferocious, terrible, turning at last with bared teeth and upraised claws to meet the death grapple. It was the hideous squealing of the tormented brute, its back to the wall, defending its lair, its mate, and its whelps, ready to bite, to rend, to batter out the life of the enemy in a primeval, bestial welter of blood and fury. The roar subsided to intermittent clamor, in the pauses of which the sounds of music and dancing made themselves audible once more. "S. Behrman again," vociferated Harron Derrick. "Chose his moment well," muttered Annixter. "Hits his hardest when we're all rounded up having a good time. Gentlemen, this is ruin. What's to be done now? Fight. My God, do you think we are going to stand this? Do you think we can?" The uproar swelled again. The clearer the assembly of ranchers understood the significance of this move on the part of the railroad, the more terrible it appeared, the more flagrant, the more intolerable. Was it possible, was it within the bounds of imagination that this tyranny should be contemplated? But they knew, past years had driven home the lesson, the implacable iron monster with whom they had to deal, and again the sense of outrage and oppression lashed them to their feet, their mouths wide with curses, their fists clenched tight, their throats hoarse with shouting. Fight? How fight? What are you going to do? If there's a law in this land, if there is, it is in Shelgrim's pocket. Who owns the courts in California? Ain't it Shelgrim? God damn him. Well, how long are you going to stand it? How long before you'll settle up accounts with 6 inches of plugged gas pipe? And our contracts, the solemn pledges of the corporation to sell to us first of all. And now the land is for sale to anybody. Why, it is a question of my home. Am I to be turned out? Why, I have put $8,000 into improving this land. And I $6,000, and now that I have, the railroad grabs it. And the system of irrigating ditches that Derrick and I have been laying out, there's thousands of dollars in that. I'll fight this out till I've spent every cent of my money. Where? In the courts that the company owns? Think I am going to give in to this? Think I am going to get off my land? By God, gentlemen, law or no law, railroad or no railroad, I will not. Nor I. Nor I. Nor I. This is the last. Legal means first. If those fail, the shotgun. They can kill me. They can shoot me down. But I'll die fighting for my home, before I'll give in to this. At length Annixter made himself heard. All out of the room but the ranch owners, he shouted. Hooven, Caraher, Dyke, you'll have to clear out. This is a family affair. Presley, you and your friend can remain. Reluctantly the others filed through the door. There remained in the harness room, besides Vanamy and Presley, Magnus Derrick, Annixter, old Broderson, Harron, Garnett from the Ruby Rancho, Keast from the ranch of the same name, Gethings of the San Pablo, Chattern of the Bonanza, about a score of others, ranchers from various parts of the county, and last of all Dabney, ignored, silent, to whom nobody spoke, and who, as yet, had not uttered a word. But the men who had been asked to leave the harness room spread the news throughout the barn. It was repeated from lip to lip. One by one the guests dropped out of the dance. Groups were formed. By swift degrees the gaiety lapsed away. The Virginia reel broke up. The musicians ceased playing, and in the place of the noisy, effervescent revelry of the previous half-hour, a subdued murmur filled all the barn, a mingling of whispers, lowered voices, the coming and going of light footsteps, the uneasy shifting of positions, while from behind the closed doors of the harness room came a prolonged, sullen hum of anger and strenuous debate. The dance came to an abrupt end. The guests, unwilling to go as yet, stunned, distressed, stood clumsily about, their eyes vague, their hands swinging at their sides, looking stupidly into each other's faces. A sense of impending calamity, oppressive, foreboding, gloomy, passed through the air overhead in the night, a long shiver of anguish and of terror, mysterious, despairing. In the harness room, however, the excitement continued unchecked. One rancher after another delivered himself of a torrent of furious words. There was no order, merely the frenzied outcry of blind fury. One spirit alone was common to all, resistance at whatever cost and to whatever lengths. Suddenly Osterman leaped to his feet, his bald head gleaming in the lamplight, his red ears distended, a flood of words filling his great horizontal slit of a mouth, his comic actor's face flaming. Like the hero of a melodrama, he took stage with a great sweeping gesture. "Organization," he shouted, "that must be our watchword. The curse of the ranchers is that they fritter away their strength. Now we must stand together. Now. Here's the crisis. Here's the moment. Shall we meet it? I call for the League. Not next week, not tomorrow, not in the morning, but now, this very moment, before we go out of that door. Every one of us here to join it, to form the beginnings of a vast organization banded together to death, if needs be, for the protection of our rights and homes. Are you ready? Is it now or never? I call for the League." Instantly there was a shout. With an actor's instinct, Osterman had spoken at the precise psychological moment. He carried the others off their feet, glib, dexterous, voluble. Just what was meant by the League the others did not know, but it was something, a vague engine, a machine with which to fight. Osterman had not done speaking before the room rang with outcries, the crowd of men shouting, for what they did not know. "The League! The League!" "Now, tonight, this moment, sign our names before we leave." "He's right. Organization. The League." "We have a committee at work already," Osterman vociferated. "I am a member, and also Mr. Broderson, Mr. Annixter, and Mr. Harron Derrick. What our aims are we will explain to you later. Let this committee be the nucleus of the League, temporarily at least. Trust us. We are working for you and with you. Let this committee be merged into the larger committee of the League, and for president of the League," he paused the fraction of a second, For president, there can be but one name mentioned, one man to whom we all must look as leader, Magnus Derrick. The governor's name was received with a storm of cheers. The harness room re-echoed with shouts of, "Derrick! Derrick! Magnus for president! Derrick, our natural leader! Derrick! Derrick! Derrick for president!" Magnus rose to his feet. He made no gesture. Erect as a cavalry officer, tall, thin, commanding, he dominated the crowd in an instant. There was a moment's hush. "Gentlemen," he said, "if organization is a good word, moderation is a better one. The matter is too grave for haste. I would suggest that we each and severally return to our respective homes for the night, sleep over what has happened, and convene again tomorrow, when we are calmer and can approach this affair in a more judicious mood. As for the office with which you would honor me, I must affirm that that, too, is a matter for grave deliberation. This league is but a name as yet. To accept control of an organization whose principles are not yet fixed is a heavy responsibility. I shrink from it." But he was allowed to proceed no further. A storm of protest developed. There were shouts of, "No, no, the League tonight, and Derrick for president. We have been moderate too long. The League first, principles afterward." "We can't wait," declared Osterman. "Many of us cannot attend a meeting tomorrow. Our business affairs would prevent it. Now we are all together. I propose a temporary chairman and secretary be named, and a ballot be taken. But first the League. Let us draw up a set of resolutions to stand together for the defense of our homes, to death if needs be, and each man present affix his signature thereto." He subsided amidst vigorous applause. The next quarter of an hour was a vague confusion, everyone talking at once, conversations going on in low tones in various corners of the room. Inks, pens, and a sheaf of foolscap were brought from the ranch house. A set of resolutions was drafted, having the force of a pledge, organizing the League of Defense. Annixter was the first to sign. Others followed, only a few holding back, refusing to join till they had thought the matter over. The roll grew. The paper circulated about the table. Each signature was welcomed by a salvo of cheers. At length it reached Harron Derrick, who signed amid tremendous uproar. He released the pen only to shake a score of hands. "Now Magnus Derrick." "Gentlemen," began the governor, once more rising, "I beg of you to allow me further consideration. Gentlemen—" He was interrupted by renewed shouting. "No, no, now or never. Sign, join the League. Don't leave us. We look to you to help." But presently the excited throng that turned their faces toward the governor were aware of a new face at his elbow. The door of the harness room had been left unbolted, and Mrs. Derrick, unable to endure the heartbreaking suspense of waiting outside, had gathered up all her courage and had come into the room. Trembling, she clung to Magnus' arm, her pretty light brown hair in disarray, her large young girl's eyes wide with terror and distrust. What was about to happen she did not understand, but these men were clamoring for Magnus to pledge himself to something, to some terrible course of action, some ruthless, unscrupulous battle to the death with the iron-hearted monster of steel and steam. Nerved with a coward's intrepidity, she, who so easily obliterated herself, had found her way into the midst of this frantic crowd, into this hot, close room, reeking of alcohol and tobacco smoke, into this atmosphere surcharged with hatred and curses. She seized her husband's arm, imploring, distraught with terror. "No, no," she murmured. "No, don't sign." She was the feather caught in the whirlwind. En masse, the crowd surged toward the erect figure of the governor, the pen in one hand, his wife's fingers in the other, the roll of signatures before him. The clamor was deafening. The excitement culminated brusquely. 100 hands stretched toward him. 30 voices at top pitch implored, expostulated, urged, almost commanded. The reverberation of the shouting was as the plunge of a cataract. It was the uprising of the people, the thunder of the outbreak of revolt, the mob demanding to be led, aroused at last, imperious, resistless, overwhelming. It was the blind fury of insurrection, the brute, many-tongued, red-eyed, bellowing for guidance, baring its teeth, unsheathing its claws, imposing its will with the abrupt, resistless pressure of the relaxed piston, inexorable, knowing no pity. "No, no," implored Annie Derrick. "No, Magnus, don't sign." "He must," declared Harron, shouting in her ear to make himself heard. "He must. Don't you understand?" Again the crowd surged forward, roaring. Mrs. Derrick was swept back, pushed to one side. Her husband no longer belonged to her. She paid the penalty for being the wife of a great man. The world, like a colossal iron wedge, crushed itself between. She was thrust to the wall. The throng of men, stamping, surrounded Magnus. She could no longer see him, but, terror-struck, she listened. There was a moment's lull, then a vast thunder of savage jubilation. Magnus had signed. Harron found his mother leaning against the wall, her hands shut over her ears, her eyes dilated with fear, brimming with tears. He led her from the harness-room to the outer room, where Mrs. Tree and Hilma took charge of her, and then, impatient, refusing to answer the hundreds of anxious questions that assailed him, hurried back to the harness-room. Already the balloting was in progress, Osterman acting as temporary chairman. On the very first ballot he was made secretary of the League pro tem, and Magnus unanimously chosen for its president. An executive committee was formed, which was to meet the next day at the Los Muertos ranch house. It was 1:30. In the barn outside the greater number of the guests had departed. Long since the musicians had disappeared. There only remained the families of the ranch owners involved in the meeting in the harness-room. These huddled in isolated groups in corners of the garish, echoing barn, the women in their wraps, the young men with their coat collars turned up against the drafts that once more made themselves felt. For a long half-hour the loud hum of eager conversation continued to issue from behind the door of the harness-room. Then, at length, there was a prolonged scraping of chairs. The session was over. The men came out in groups, searching for their families. At once the homeward movement began. Everyone was worn out. Some of the ranchers' daughters had gone to sleep against their mothers' shoulders. Billy, the stableman, and his assistant were awakened, and the teams were hitched up. The stable-yard was full of a maze of swinging lanterns and buggy lamps. The horses fretted, champing the bits. The carryalls creaked with the straining of leather and springs as they received their loads. At every instant one heard the rattle of wheels as vehicle after vehicle disappeared in the night. A fine, drizzling rain was falling, and the lamps began to show dim in a vague haze of orange light. Magnus Derrick was the last to go. At the doorway of the barn he found Annixter, the roll of names, which it had been decided he was to keep in his safe for the moment, under his arm. Silently the two shook hands. Magnus departed. The grind of the wheels of his carryall grated sharply on the gravel of the driveway in front of the ranch house, then, with a hollow roll across a little plank ridge, gained the roadway. For a moment the beat of the horse's hoofs made itself heard on the roadway. It ceased. Suddenly there was a great silence. Annixter, in the doorway of the great barn, stood looking about him for a moment, alone, thoughtful. The barn was empty. That astonishing evening had come to an end. The whirl of things and people, the crowd of dancers, Delaney, the gunfight, Hilma Tree, her eyes fixed on him in mute confession, the rabble in the harness-room, the news of the regrade, the fierce outburst of wrath, the hasty organizing of the League, all went spinning confusedly through his recollection. But he was exhausted, time enough in the morning to think it all over. By now it was raining sharply. He put the roll of names into his inside pocket, threw a sack over his head and shoulders, and went down to the ranch house. But in the harness-room, lighted by the glittering lanterns and flaring lamps, in the midst of overturned chairs, spilled liquor, cigar stumps, and broken glasses, Vanamy and Presley still remained talking. At length they rose and came out upon the floor of the barn, and stood for a moment looking about them. Billy, the stableman, was going the rounds of the walls, putting out light after light. By degrees the vast interior was growing dim. Upon the roof overhead the rain drummed incessantly, the eaves dripping. The floor was littered with pine needles, bits of orange peel, ends and fragments of torn organdies and muslins, and bits of tissue paper from the fridge and bonnets and liberty caps. The buckskin mare in the stall, dozing on 3 legs, changed position with a long sigh. The sweat stiffening the hair upon her back and loins as it dried gave off a penetrating, ammoniacal odor that mingled with the stale perfume of sachet and wilted flowers. Presley and Vanamy stood looking at the deserted barn. There was a long silence. Then Presley said, "Well, what do you think of it all?" "I think," answered Vanamy slowly, "I think that there was a dance in Brussels the night before Waterloo." Book 2, Chapter 1. In his office at San Francisco, seated before a massive desk of polished redwood, very ornate, Lyman Derrick sat dictating letters to his typewriter on a certain morning early in the spring of the year. The subdued monotone of his voice proceeded evenly from sentence to sentence, regular, precise, businesslike. "I have the honor to acknowledge herewith your favor of the 14th instant, and in reply would state, please find enclosed draft upon New Orleans to be applied as per our understanding. In answer to your favor number 1107, referring to the case of the city and county of San Francisco against Excelsior Warehouse and Storage Company, I would say—" His voice continued, expressionless, measured, distinct. While he spoke, he swung slowly back and forth in his leather swivel chair, his elbows resting on the arms, his pop eyes fixed vaguely upon the calendar on the opposite wall, winking at intervals when he paused searching for a word. "That's all for the present," he said at length. Without reply, the typewriter rose and withdrew, thrusting her pencil into the coil of her hair, closing the door behind her, softly, discreetly. When she had gone, Lyman rose, stretching himself, putting up 3 fingers to hide his yawn. To further loosen his muscles, he took a couple of turns the length of the room, noting with satisfaction its fine appointments, the padded red carpet, the dull olive-green tint of the walls, the few choice engravings, portraits of Marshall, Taney, Field, and a colored lithograph, excellently done, of the Grand Canyon of the Colorado. The deep-seated leather chairs, the large and crowded bookcase, topped with a bust of James Lick and a huge greenish globe, the wastebasket of woven colored grass made by Navajo Indians, the massive silver inkstand on the desk, the elaborate filing cabinet, complete in every particular, and the shelves of tin boxes, padlocked, impressive, grave, bearing the names of clients, cases, and estates. He was between 31 and 35 years of age. Unlike Harrod, he resembled his mother, but he was much darker than Annie Derrick, and his eyes were much fuller, the eyeball protruding, giving him a pop-eyed foreign expression, quite unusual and unexpected. His hair was black, and he wore a small, tight, pointed mustache, which he was in the habit of pushing delicately upward from the corners of his lips with the ball of his thumb, the little finger extended. As often as he made this gesture, he prefaced it with a little twisting gesture of the forearm in order to bring his cuff into view, and, in fact, this movement by itself was habitual. He was dressed carefully, his trousers creased, a pink rose in his lapel. His shoes were of patent leather, his cutaway coat was of very rough black cheviot, his double-breasted waistcoat of tan cupboard cloth with buttons of smoked pearl. An ascot scarf, a great puff of heavy black silk, was at his neck, the knot transfixed by a tiny golden pin set off with an opal and 4 small diamonds. At one end of the room were 2 great windows of plate glass, and pausing at length before one of these, Lyman selected a cigarette from his curved box of oxidized silver, lit it, and stood looking down and out, willing to be idle for a moment, amused and interested in the view. His office was on the 10th floor of the Exchange Building, a beautiful tower-like affair of white stone that stood on the corner of Market Street near its intersection with Kearny, the most imposing office building of the city. Below him the city swarmed tumultuous through its grooves, the cable cars starting and stopping with a gay jangling of bells and a strident whirring of jostled glass windows. Drays and carts clattered over the cobbles, and an incessant shuffling of thousands of feet rose from the pavement. Around Lotta's fountain, the baskets of the flower sellers, crammed with chrysanthemums, violets, pinks, roses, lilies, hyacinths, set a brisk note of color in the gray of the street. But to Lyman's notion, the general impression of this center of the city's life was not one of strenuous business activity. It was a continuous interest in small things, a people ever willing to be amused at trifles, refusing to consider serious matters, good-natured, allowing themselves to be imposed upon, taking life easily, generous, companionable, enthusiastic, living, as it were, from day to day, in a place where the luxuries of life were had without effort, in a city that offered to consideration the restlessness of a New York without its earnestness, the serenity of a Naples without its languor, the romance of a Seville without its picturesqueness. As Lyman turned from the window, about to resume his work, the office boy appeared at the door. "The man from the lithograph company, sir," announced the boy. "Well, what does he want?" demanded Lyman, adding, however, upon the instant, "Show him in." A young man entered, carrying a great bundle, which he deposited on a chair, with a gasp of relief, exclaiming, all out of breath, "From the Standard Lithograph Company." "What is?" "Don't know," replied the other. "Maps, I guess." "I don't want any maps. Who sent them? I guess you're mistaken." Lyman tore the cover from the top of the package, drawing out one of a great many huge sheets of white paper, folded 8 times. Suddenly he uttered an exclamation. "Ah, I see. They are maps. But these should not have come here. They are to go to the regular office for distribution." He wrote a new direction on the label of the package. "Take them to that address," he went on. "I'll keep this one here. The others go to that address. If you see Mr. Darrell, tell him that Mr. Derrick, you get the name, Mr. Derrick may not be able to get around this afternoon, but to go ahead with any business just the same." The young man departed with the package, and Lyman, spreading out the map upon the table, remained for some time studying it thoughtfully. It was a commissioner's official railway map of the state of California, completed to March 30th of that year. Upon it the different railways of the state were accurately plotted in various colors, blue, green, and yellow. However, the blue, the yellow, and the green were but brief traceries, very short, isolated, unimportant. At a little distance these could hardly be seen. The whole map was gridironed by a vast, complicated network of red lines marked P and SWRR. These centralized at San Francisco, and thence ramified and spread north, east, and south to every quarter of the state. From Coles, in the topmost corner of the map, to Yuma in the lowest, from Reno on one side to San Francisco on the other, ran the plexus of red, a veritable system of blood circulation, complicated, dividing and reuniting, branching, splitting, extending, throwing out feelers, offshoots, taproots, feeders, diminutive little blood-suckers that shot out from the main jugular and went twisting up into some remote county, laying hold upon some forgotten village or town, involving it in one of a myriad branching coils, one of 100 tentacles, drawing it, as it were, toward that center from which all this system sprang. The map was white, and it seemed as if all the color which should have gone to vivify the various counties, towns, and cities marked upon it had been absorbed by that huge, sprawling organism with its ruddy arteries converging to a central point. It was as though the state had been sucked white and colorless, and against this pallid background the red arteries of the monster stood out, swollen with life-blood, reaching out to infinity, gorging to bursting, an excrescence, a gigantic parasite fattening upon the life-blood of an entire commonwealth. However, in an upper corner of the map appeared the names of the 3 new commissioners, Jones McNish for the 1st District, Lyman Derrick for the 2nd, and James Darrell for the 3rd. Nominated in the Democratic State Convention in the fall of the preceding year, Lyman, backed by the coteries of San Francisco bosses in the pay of his father's political committee of ranchers, had been elected, together with Darrell, the candidate of the Pueblo and Mojave Road, and McNish, the avowed candidate of the Pacific and Southwestern. Darrell was rabidly against the P and SW, McNish rabidly for it. Lyman was supposed to be the conservative member of the board, the ranchers' candidate, it was true, and faithful to their interests, but a calm man, deliberative, swayed by no such violent emotions as his colleagues. Osterman's dexterity had at last succeeded in entangling Magnus inextricably in the new politics.